to the valley, to the sea. All the places, all the people that you can meet.
Welcome to the Mississippi Valley Traveler Podcast. I'm Dean Klinkenberg, and I've been exploring the deep history and rich culture of the people and places along America's greatest river, the Mississippi, since 2007. Join me as I go deep into the characters and places along the river and occasionally wander into other stories from the Midwest and other rivers. Read the episode show notes and get more information on the Mississippi at MississippiValleyTraveler.com. Let's get going. Welcome to episode 59 of the Mississippi Valley Traveler Podcast. Well, Frank Dodge is back, and I'm going to devote this episode to telling you about the new book. It's called Murder on the Mississippi, and it's the fourth book in the Frank Dodge series. I like to think you can read any of those, the four books in the series, as a standalone or part of the series, if you're one of those folks who prefers to start at the beginning and follow through. I think this book will be fine. It's a standalone read as well. There are some storylines for Frank's personal life that kind of follow a thread from beginning to end, and you may want to go back and catch up on some of that if you start with this book. But it's certainly not critical to reading and enjoying this particular book. Let me read you the sales description for this so you can get a sense of the story itself. Some sins refuse to stay buried. Murder was the last thing Frank Dodge expected to find on a Mississippi River cruise. But when three sisters board the riverboat River Voyager, hunting for their father's killers, Frank's simple writing assignment transforms into a deadly game of cat and mouse. The stakes grow higher when another passenger vanishes overboard under suspicious circumstances. Joining forces with his friend Brian Jefferson, a homicide detective, Frank races against time to solve both mysteries before the cruise reaches Memphis. But the killers won't give up their carefully crafted new identities without a fight. As Frank and his allies dig deeper, they discover the boat harbors dark secrets in its shadowy corners. With each revelation, they draw closer to a confrontation 4 decades in the making. Can they unmask the killers before another body hits the water? Murder on the Mississippi masterfully blends mystery and history against the haunting backdrop of America's greatest river. Rich with complex characters and atmospheric detail, this riveting tale explores the true cost of justice delayed and the weight of unforgivable crimes. Step aboard for a cruise where the past and present collide in deadly fashion. Get Murder on the Mississippi today. So this book is already available for pre-orders on all of the usual platforms. The official release is April 8th. So you'll have a copy in hand on April 8th if you pre-order a copy now. And if you live in the St. Louis area, I'm going to throw a release party on Sunday, April 27th at 6 p.m. at the Schlafly Tap Room. I will post information about that in the show notes. Come on down if you want to buy a print copy, and I'll be happy to sign it for you there if you like. So the idea for this story had been bouncing around in my head for a few years, but it took a while to write. I had contracts from 2 publishers to write other books, to write Mississippi River Mayhem and The Wild Mississippi. And then in the middle of all of that, in an 18-month stretch, both of my parents passed away, and I just didn't have the enthusiasm to write much of anything for a few months at a time after each one passed away. But I'm back now. The inspiration for this book came from a story I learned a few years ago about the murder of 2 African-American men in Mississippi in the 1960s that really raised a lot of questions for me. And I wrote about this in my book, Mississippi River Mayhem. There's a chapter about this. And I'm going to read that chapter to you next. So thanks to those of you who continue to support me through Patreon. I'm deeply grateful for your ongoing support. It makes me feel good, and your support keeps this podcast rolling along. If you're not a Patreon kind of person, then you can buy me a coffee. So go to MississippiValleyTraveler.com/podcast, and you can buy me a coffee there, or you can get a link to join the Patreon community. At the same link, MississippiValleyTraveler.com/podcast, you'll also find links to all previous episodes, all 58 previous episodes that you can binge in the glory of Mississippi River history and storytelling. And you'll also find the show notes for each episode, including this one. So now, let's get on with the story. It was May 2nd, 1964, and the air already felt Mississippi muggy. In the United States, the Beatles' latest single, Can't Buy Me Love, rose to the top of the music charts. From Russia with Love and the Carpetbaggers drew crowds to movie theaters. In Meadville, Mississippi, Henry Dee and Charles Moore, both 19 years old and with their eyes on the future, needed a ride. Dee was outgoing and personable with a reputation for being a snappy dresser, a flair he may have picked up during one of the trips he took to Chicago to visit an aunt. Dee's grandmother had raised him. She took him in after his mother was institutionalized for mental illness. Moore was a student at Alcorn A&M College. He was bright and curious and dreamed big. His father died when he was very young, so his mother had raised him and his brother Thomas by herself. She pieced together a living by working in the home of a white family and from public assistance. Thomas Moore remembered, "We was three people that loved each other, cared about each other. You never thought about not spending your life with these people." Dee was trying to get to the nearby town of Roxy to pick up his paycheck from a lumber company where he worked. Moore just wanted to go home. They'd stopped in a store where they each bought a honey bun and a large soda and bumped into a friend, Joe Lee Rollins. They asked him for a lift, but Rollins' father didn't allow him to drive out of town, so Dee and Moore did what they had always done. They hitchhiked for a ride. Moore and Dee exited the store and stood near Meadville's ice cream shop. A white Volkswagen pulled over, and the driver offered them a ride. Dee and Moore turned him down, but the driver insisted they get in. He said he worked for the Internal Revenue Service, and he was investigating bootleggers in the area. He wouldn't take no for an answer. They got in. The driver, James Ford Seal, drove them deep into the nearby Homochito National Forest. 4 men followed close behind in a pickup truck: Charles Marcus Edwards, Clyde Seal, Archie Prather, and Curtis Dunn. None of them were federal agents. They were part of the Ku Klux Klan and an especially violent wing that was based around Franklin County. The Klanmen had a mission. Outsiders were increasingly coming into Mississippi to dismantle the structures of white supremacy. Activists traveled around the region organizing blacks to vote and challenging the status quo. African Americans were making demands for equal treatment. Some Klan members feared that African Americans were stockpiling weapons in preparation for a war to end white dominance. One of the Klanmen, Edwards, had singled out Dee as someone who might be bringing guns into Franklin County. His frequent trips to Chicago made him suspicious to the Klan, and he sometimes wore a black bandana, which the Klan associated with radical black activists. The Klan wanted Dee. Moore was in the wrong place at the wrong time. In the forest, the Klanmen tied Dee and Moore to a tree and beat them savagely. They asked them repeatedly to reveal the locations where blacks had been storing guns. The Klanmen beat Dee and Moore until they bled and were nearly unconscious. Under duress, Dee and Moore told the Klanmen that the Reverend Clyde Briggs had stored guns in the basement of Roxy Baptist Church. Edwards and 2 others left the forest and went right to local law enforcement with the quote-unquote confession they had obtained. Sheriff Wayne Hutto and Patrolman Bernice Beasley went to the Roxy Baptist Church and searched it. They didn't bother with a warrant. They searched the entire building but didn't find any weapons. Afterwards, they kept quiet about the search so folks wouldn't know they'd been working with the Klan. After Edwards and the others went to the sheriff, the other Klanmen took Dee and Moore to Seal's farm, where they called for more help. 2 men answered, Ernest Parker and Seal's brother Jack. Parker was part of a wealthy family in Natchez that had invested heavily in segregation. The Parkers had funded private, whites-only schools and supported Americans for the Preservation of the White Race, a white nationalist group. The Klanmen tied up Dee and Moore and taped their mouths shut, then tossed them into the trunk of a car that they had covered with a plastic tarp. For 90 minutes they drove, traveling from Seal's farm to Natchez, crossing the Mississippi River, then heading north to an isolated backwater slough near Davis Island, the place where Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederate States of America, once lived in a big plantation. Ernest Parker and his brother Robert Lee Parker III owned thousands of acres on the island, so some locals called it Parker's Island. The Parkers raised cattle on the island, but they also spent a lot of time hunting and fishing there. They had built a boat landing on the Louisiana side to make it easier to ferry supplies across. When the Klanmen reached the landing, they stopped, opened the trunk, and got Dee and Moore out. They were surprised to discover that both men were still alive, but it didn't change their plans. They strapped Dee to an engine block from a 1944 Jeep, then put Dee into a boat. James and Jack Seal rowed the boat into the Mississippi, then threw Dee overboard. Moore almost certainly watched as his friend disappeared into the Mississippi River. The Klanmen rowed back to shore, then tied Moore to train rails. James Seal and Ernest Parker rowed the boat with Moore back into the middle of the channel and threw Moore into the water too. When Thomas Moore went home on leave in June 1964 after completing basic training, his brother was missing. No one, though, was searching for him. A story went around that Dee and Moore had gone to Louisiana to look for work. Moore and Dee might have disappeared into history as anonymous victims of Klan violence if not for one big event. On June 21, 6 weeks after the Klanmen killed Dee and Moore, 3 young men who had been working to register African-American voters, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, vanished. Their disappearance made national news and triggered a massive search led by the FBI. On July 12th, a fisherman spotted human remains, the lower half of a body, on a piece of driftwood near Tallulah, Louisiana. The next day, another set of partial remains surfaced nearby. The bodies got the attention of the FBI. One of the dead men was wearing a bronze belt buckle with an M on it, so there was speculation that it could be the body of Michael Schwerner. It wasn't, though. Officials tentatively identified the dead men as Dee and Moore. Thomas Moore was playing ping pong on base when he was told that his brother's remains had been found. He went back home, where he made the heartbreaking confirmation that one of the men was indeed his brother Charles. It was Thomas, after all, who had given that brass belt buckle to him. Charles's death would haunt Thomas for decades. Divers returned to Davis Island in October and recovered more of the 2 men's remains, as well as the Jeep engine and rails. The next month, on November 6th, the Mississippi Highway Safety Patrol arrested James Ford Seal and Charles Marcus Edwards for the murders of Dee and Moore. Edwards confessed to picking up the men and beating them, but denied doing anything else. Seal didn't admit to anything. They were released on bail the next day. 2 months later, in early January 1965, the local district attorney, Lennox Foreman, dropped the charges against Seal and Edwards. Foreman said that the cases had become too difficult to prosecute because Seal and Edwards had alleged that law enforcement had mistreated them after being arrested. Foreman probably also understood all too well that he had no chance of convincing an all-white jury in Mississippi to convict the 2 men. He was an elected official, so pursuing a case like that would have jeopardized his political career. Foreman was also afraid of the Klan, and had cause to be. Klan members sometimes snuck onto his property at night and shot his cattle. Sometimes when he traveled to court hearings, he requested a police escort. Unknown to Foreman, by September 1964, the FBI had gathered a lot of details about the Dee and Moore murders, thanks to an informant within the Klan. The FBI, though, didn't share any of that information with Foreman or other local law enforcement, mainly because the FBI didn't trust local law enforcement in Franklin County. Too many of them were affiliated with or sympathetic to the Klan. The FBI, consumed with solving the murders of the 3 civil rights workers, assumed that Foreman had accumulated enough evidence on his own to prosecute. The FBI also had that valuable informant, and given the ongoing threats, they didn't want to jeopardize that information pipeline. After Foreman gave up on pursuing the case, the FBI followed suit. By May 1966, no one at any level of law enforcement was investigating the murders of Henry Dee and Charles Moore.
Hey, Dean Klinkenberg here, interrupting myself. Just wanted to remind you that if you'd like to know more about the Mississippi River, check out my books. I write the Mississippi Valley Traveler Guidebooks for people who want to get to know the Mississippi better. I also write the Frank Dodge Mystery Series that is set in places along the Mississippi. My newest book, The Wild Mississippi, goes deep into the world of Old Man River. Learn about the varied and complex ecosystem supported by the Mississippi, the plant and animal life that depends on them, and where you can go to experience it all. Find any of these wherever books are sold.
For the next 30 years, no one bothered to investigate those murders either. By the mid-1990s, momentum was building to reopen unsolved murder cases from the Civil Rights era. In 1994, a jury convicted Brian de Beckwith of killing Medgar Evers back in the 1960s. 5 years after that case, the journalist Connie Chung and producer Harry Phillips investigated a couple of Civil Rights era murders for the ABC News program 2020. One of those cases was the Dee Moore murders. Still, the FBI decided not to pursue charges against anyone, and in June 2003, they closed the cases again. In 2005, Canadian journalist David Ridgen took an interest in the case. He reached out to Thomas Moore, who brushed Ridgen aside for weeks before finally talking to him. By that time, Thomas had retired after a 30-year career in the military, which included a tour in Vietnam as a gunner in a Huey helicopter. Thomas carried a heavy burden from his brother's death, a mixture of grief and rage and self-blame. He had always been there to look out for Charles, and couldn't help but feel that he had let down his brother by not being there to protect him. It deeply troubled Thomas that no one had been held to account for killing him. He had sometimes fantasized about getting revenge against the men who killed Charles, but his mother had talked him down. When he retired from the military, he settled in Colorado. He had no intention of going back to Mississippi. He didn't feel safe there. When Ridgen contacted him, he was living in Colorado. Thomas had no reason to trust a journalist, so he took his time responding. The two hit it off, though, and Thomas agreed to travel with Ridgen back to Mississippi to look into the case and to take part in a documentary that Ridgen was filming called Mississippi Cold Case. They soon learned that there were only two men still living who were involved in the murder: Charles Marcus Edwards and James Ford Seal. By the time Thomas Moore and Ridgen started piecing together the evidence, prosecutors had tried several other men for Civil Rights era murders. Juries had convicted each one. Thomas and Ridgen revisited the sites associated with the murders of Dee and Moore, consulted with the federal attorney Dunlampin, who had jurisdiction over the case, and pored through long-forgotten FBI files. They even dropped in, unannounced, on Edwards and Seal, neither of whom welcomed their visit. Federal officials were soon able to convince Edwards to testify against Seal, though. The combination of immunity from prosecution and Edwards' troubled conscience was enough to convince him to break the oath of secrecy he had taken when he joined the Klan decades earlier. Had he broken that oath much earlier, the Klan would have killed him. On January 24, 2007, a federal grand jury returned an indictment against Seal for 2 counts of kidnapping and 1 count of conspiracy to kidnap. Police arrested Seal and put him in jail. 4 months later, his trial began. Thomas Moore sat near the front of the courtroom to watch the proceedings, as did Thelma Collins, Henry Dee's sister. Dee's mother was still alive, but institutionalized, and the family had never told her that her son had been murdered. Seal, who was sickly enough that some, including his attorney, wondered if he'd survive the trial, did not take the stand in his own defense. In one of the more dramatic moments of the trial, Edwards, from the witness chair, apologized to the Dee and Moore families and asked for forgiveness for his role in the murders. On June 14, the jury returned a quick verdict. Seal was guilty on all counts. 2 months later, the judge sentenced the 71-year-old Seal to life in prison. A year after that, while Seal was confined at the federal penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana, an appeals court threw out his conviction, determining that the statute of limitations had expired. The full appeals court then reviewed the case, but split 9-9. As a result, Seal's conviction stood. On August 2, 2011, Seal died in prison. Thomas Moore and Thelma Collins accepted Edwards' apology. They each took his hand and forgave him. It didn't make up for what Edwards and the other Klanmen had done, but for Moore anyway, it was an act that God demanded of him. Unlike Edwards, Seal never publicly owned up to his actions, and he never asked for anyone's forgiveness. The bodies of Moore and Dee weren't the only ones found in the Mississippi River. Most of the dead pulled from the river were African American. Elizabeth Sutherland Martinez, then a student working on the Mississippi Summer Freedom Project, observed in a letter, quote, "Mississippi is the only state where you can drag a river any time and find bodies you were not expecting. Things are really much better for rabbits. There's a closed season on rabbits." Unquote. Justice was incomplete and slow for the killers of Charles Moore and Henry Dee, but at least it was served, partially. After the verdict came down, Thomas Moore said he felt like a tremendous burden had been lifted from him. In 2011, Thomas Moore went back to Meadville, Mississippi to talk with Edwards. They walked among the fruit trees Edwards tended and talked over coffee. They revisited the murders, their feelings about what had happened, about what God expected of them, and about reconciliation. The following Sunday, Thomas Moore joined Edwards for services at the Bunkley Baptist Church, a congregation that had once been exclusively white. Moore and Edwards sat together near the front. The trial in 2007 and Edwards' apology couldn't bring back Charles Moore and Henry Dee, and it certainly didn't make up for the decades-long reign of terror against African Americans. But the long-sought conviction gave the family some closure. Thomas Moore felt a burden lifted. Justice was served to Seal. Small steps for sure, but at least they were forward. In 2008, President Bush signed the Emmett Till Unsolved Civil Rights Crime Act. The legislation directed the FBI to reopen unsolved murders of African Americans committed before December 31, 1969. The FBI identified 113 cold cases with 126 murder victims, which was almost certainly just a portion of the actual murders. 8 years later, the FBI had closed 105 of those cases. Only one had resulted in a conviction, though. Prosecuting perpetrators 40-plus years after a murder is extraordinarily difficult, as many of the people involved had died. Double jeopardy also came into play at times, as some perpetrators had been tried once before and acquitted by all-white juries. Righting past wrongs is a monumental task, but as Thomas Moore said, quote, "When you get an opportunity to correct some wrong, then you take that opportunity," unquote. And sometimes the present catches up anyway. In 2015, voters in Natchez and Adams County, the area that had once been an epicenter of Klan activity and where law enforcement often worked hand in hand with the Klan, elected a black man, Travis Patton, as sheriff. So that's where the idea for my new book began. I don't want to spoil any plot points, but let's just say that one of the issues that intrigued me was the lasting impact of a crime like that on family members. And in Murder on the Mississippi, I get to explore that issue in some depth. As I mentioned, the book is now available for pre-order everywhere books are sold. You can even go to your favorite local bookstore and order a copy. It officially releases on April 8th. And if you're in the St. Louis area again on April 27, drop by the Schlafly Tap Room at 6 p.m. for the release party where you can buy print copies and get them signed. And by the way, if you haven't seen the new book covers for the Frank Dodge series, check them out in the show notes or in any of the online marketplaces. I really love these new covers and feel like they come a lot closer to my original vision for the series than I was able to do when I first released those books. A very exciting time. I'm proud of this latest book. I hope you'll enjoy it and let me know what you think about it. I'll see you next time. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to the series on your favorite podcast app so you don't miss out on future episodes. I offer the podcast for free, but when you support the show with a few bucks through Patreon, you help keep the program going. Just go to patreon.com/Dean Klinkenberg. If you want to know more about the Mississippi River, check out my books. I write the Mississippi Valley Traveler guidebooks for people who want to get to know the Mississippi better. I also write the Frank Dodge Mystery Series that's set in places along the river. Find them wherever books are sold. The Mississippi Valley Traveler podcast is written and produced by me, Dean Klinkenberg. Original music by No Offense. See you next time.